Right, we're going to talk about reserves in champagne. Now, reserve wine is a term you hear a lot. If you look on a non-vintage champagne or talk to a winemaker, they might say we've got 30-35% reserve wine in our champagne, in our non-vintage. What does that actually mean? And is there another kind of reserve? Well, there kind of is, and it's called the Réserve Individuelle, and it's one of the most interesting and unique things about champagne. There's nowhere else in the world that has a reserve wine system that's the same as champagne. So I'm going to take you through it with the help of my grapes and a few props. But first, a bit of background. So champagne is a wildly varying place to grow grapes. Yields can vary enormously year to year. You can get one year with frost, heavy frost and downy mildew, very low yields. And then the next year you could get perfect, beautiful, sunny flowering, enormous yields. That would normally make the supply of champagne do that. And champagne doesn't really want that. Champagne wants a more even supply. It doesn't want stocks to build up in the cellars. You've got to remember, champagne obviously ages for a number of years before it's released. It doesn't want those stocks to build up too high relative to sales, because that's going to make people want to sell champagne, clear their cellars, and maybe put downwards price pressure on champagne. Equally, champagne doesn't want to run too low on stocks, because that's going to make champagnes be sold maybe too young, with not enough time in the cellars on lees, which could be damaging for the quality or reputation of the wines. And also it could risk of interruptions in supplies of champagnes, as we actually have seen a bit recently, which is also not commercially ideal. So champagne wants to turn that nature gives us into that on the shelf. And reserve wine is how it does it. Now, I've got my hectare of vines here with some lovely grapes on the vine. I've also got my reserve system, my own reserve wines, and I've got my Réserve Individuelle. Now, every year, the growers and the négociants, the people that buy the grapes, you've got to remember, champagne is largely made up of growers that sell their grapes to buyers that make champagne. They get together and they decide what the yield that year is going to be. Now, that's not really necessarily related to what's on the vines. It's more related to the commercial environment and how much, what the stock position in champagne is at the moment, how sales doing, how much champagne do we want to make? Do we want to make loads to keep up with the sales demand that's happening at the moment and is forecast? Or do we want to kind of take our foot off the gas a little bit and make sure those stocks don't build up? So they get together. That's just happened actually in 2022. They've come out and said, okay, we're going to take 12 tonnes a hectare as our official yield this year. They get together, and that is not how many grapes you can pick, it's how much effectively of the wine you make is allowed to become champagne that year. So let's take a kind of average, or not an average, but an example year in champagne, where I've got 14 tonnes per hectare in my vineyard there. And the yield is agreed at 12. I've got more than I'm allowed to make. But my Réserve Individuelle has got 6 tonnes per hectare. Now, this is a reserve wine system, so it's usually made up of excess from big years that I'm not allowed to use. It is controlled by the champagne authorities. I'm only allowed to use it when they say, and I'm only allowed to keep a maximum of 8 tonnes per hectare in there. So I've got 6 in at the moment, I've got 14 in my vineyards, I'm allowed to make 12 into champagne, so I'm going to be allowed to put 2 in there to make that's full now. And the rest of the 12 here, I'm going to maybe make my nice blends and my vintages. Let's pop them in, and I'm going to take some wine out of my own reserve system. This is the reserve system I've created from wines that I'm allowed to use and turn into champagne whenever I want. So I'm going to take 3 out of there. You know, I could have a perpetual reserve or some barrels, or this is part of the style of my wines. You know, it's really important to me. So I'm going to put 3 down to replace that, and there we go. I've made enough champagne, I've replenished my reserves, and I've got a full Réserve Individuelle. Happy days. Now let's take a different kind of year. Let's take a year like, let's take 2020, for example. So 2020, let's say I've got, how many got here? I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on my vines. I've got 10 on my vines. I've got a full Réserve Individuelle, let's say. I can't fit any more. I'm not allowed more than 8 in there. But 2020, COVID, not a lot of optimism around the champagne market. So the maisons, the houses, don't want to buy too many grapes. They don't want that yield set too high because they're not confident that they're going to be selling much champagne. They don't want their stocks to build up too high. So the yield is set at 8. Growers aren't very happy about that, a lot of them, because they've got more than 8 in their vineyards. And that means that if Réserve Individuelle are full, and I've got 10 here, and the official yield is only 8, there's 2 that I can't use for champagne. They're not going to be used. They're going to be sent off to distillery for industrial alcohol, paint stripper. Not so glamorous, but that's kind of the valve, the escape valve for when champagne's system of controlling its supply works in that way. That's what happens. So let's look at another year. Let's look at 2021. So 2021, very difficult year in champagne. I've got a grape stuck in there. That's a lemon glass for you. So in 2021, I've only got 6 tons per hectare in my vineyards. But actually, the pessimism of 2020 didn't come to pass. Everyone's buying champagne. Sales are up. I need to make some wine. And I only got 6 tons of grapes in my vineyards. I've got a full Réserve Individuelle, so champagne authorities are going to issue a déblocage. They're going to unblock some of that reserve to help me top up my harvest. So let's say I'm going to actually take another 1, 2, 3, 4 out of there, and then I can use those to help me make my assemblage there. And I can maybe gonna need to use some of this as well to help me make enough wine. Definitely. In fact, I'm probably going to need to use quite a lot of it. So even people's own reserve systems became pretty empty. They might be able to put a little bit down in 2021, but reserves are running pretty low. And that's what we ended up looking like at the end of 2021, which is why everyone's quite happy that 2022 looks like a decent year, because we should be able to top that up a bit as well, and hopefully make enough wine. Now, you might have noticed I've got a bit of a rotten grape in there. That's on purpose. So I'm going to show you one other nice little quirk of this system. We're going to scoot back to 2018. 2018, enormous year, masses in the vineyard, more than you could ever believe. And also, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, full Réserve Individuelle. It's at 8, let's say, or pretty much full for everyone. So we can't put wine in there. We've got more grapes in the vineyard than champagne's going to allow us to use to make into champagne that year. It's going to look like we're going to be sending quite a lot of that off then to distillery. Bit of a shame. But there's a silver lining. You can take wine that's not so good out of your Réserve Individuelle, which in this case was 2017. A lot of it was not on tip-top form. And you can replace it with a nice year and send that wine off to distillery. So actually there is a way that you can keep improving the quality of your Réserve Individuelle and your reserve wine as well. And this kind of sophisticated reserve system is really one of champagne's greatest assets. It doesn't always keep everyone happy, but it's a pretty smart system, and I hope that was helped understand a little bit about how it works.